English translation, 222nd contact. Wednesday, 3rd in February, 1988, 04:10 hours.
Dear friend, yesterday, I was asked a question about the Princess of Monte Carlo. That is, of Monaco, just with respect to the American former actress Grace Patricia Kelly, who received the sovereign title and the name Grimaldi through her marriage with Prince Rainier III of Monaco. The princess had an accident with her car on the 13th of September 1982 during a return trip from the royal summer residence La Turbie to Monaco, along with her 17-year-old daughter Stephanie. The next day, on the 14th of September, she succumbed to her serious injuries. The princess and her vehicle went off the road in a hairpin curve, fell down a slope, and flipped over several times. Daughter Stephanie had only suffered minor injuries, and it was said that she had driven the car without authorization. And now, exactly concerning this, I was asked whether this had actually been the case. At that time, to my knowledge, you sought to clarify the matter, for whatever reasons.
That is of correctness. My clarification occurred as a result of my own interests. What I have fathomed with this, however, has no relevance at all to the assertion that the princess's daughter Stephanie had driven the crashed vehicle. The truth and the reality is that Princess Grace Patricia Kelly, or rather Grimaldi, suffered a sudden, severe brain hemorrhage, which acted like a sudden, severe stroke and caused an immediate loss of consciousness, through which, of course, also the control of her vehicle was lost, and she unavoidably came to the serious accident.
That sounds logical. It also seemed illogical to me that Miss Kelly should have let her daughter, who was still a minor, behind the wheel. But since we are already talking about such things, I would like to concern you once again with regard to a question that appeals to your medical and psychiatric knowledge. Recently, I had to concern myself another time with the so-called voices, and to be sure, in reference to a man from New Zealand. His name is Kiwi, just as also the Chinese kiwi fruit is called, namely the fruit of the Chinese gooseberry shrub, or in the language of the Maori, the New Zealand kiwi bird, a nocturnal flightless ratite. The long and short of it, to my knowledge, the hearing of voices concerns a form of schizophrenia, through which those who are afflicted by it hear a voice or multiple voices in their heads, or something.
That is also of correctness. With the hearing of voices, it concerns a form of schizophrenia, through which acoustic hallucinations are produced in the form of a voice or even several human voices, animal sounds, or thing-related tones, which are heard by the human beings afflicted by this form of schizophrenia in their consciousnesses, because it has fallen into a schizophrenic disorder. Those who are afflicted by this form of schizophrenia suppose themselves to be listeners of conversations, or to perceive any other sounds, noises, tones, or even music in an allegedly real form. In severe cases of this type of schizophrenia, even alleged dialogues occur between the hallucinatory voices and schizophrenic human beings, which also often leads to the fact that those afflicted by this disease of consciousness respond to alleged commands of the hallucinatory voices, and carrying out and committing actions and deeds that are incomprehensible to a normally healthy human being. Thus, homicides of this kind appear not infrequently in a simple or serial form, because the murder or killing of humans and animals, or the destruction of pictures and articles, etc., are ordered by the alleged hallucinatory communication of the putative hallucinatory voices. An occurrence through which confused, sick, deranged, and illogical as well as reason-poor thinking is caused with this form of schizophrenia in certain respects. A condition that does not have to be permanently present, but which can also only appear sporadically. Those afflicted by this may even be human beings of good education, because the schizophrenia exhibits a split consciousness, which is determined not by the intelligence, but by hallucinations, and thus by an impairment of consciousness or by a pathological change in the state of consciousness. In harmless cases, the form of schizophrenia of the hearing of voices appears with the so-called dead speakers, ghost speakers, otherworld speakers, and extraterrestrial speakers, who, from time to time, through inner voices, even through the hearing of voices, supposedly accept that they would hear voices of the dead, ghosts, demons, otherworldly ones, and extraterrestrials, and would even communicate with these. On the earth, you call such human beings mediums, necromancers and channelers, etc., but who, as explained, truly only have inner voices and believe that they would receive commands or messages from these and even communicate with them. Another form of this illness of consciousness also causes putative telepathic voices through unrealistic forms of thought and beliefs, through which those afflicted by this illness believe that they would stand in telepathic connection with any beings of a worldly, otherworldly, or of other dimensional or extraterrestrial form. Those afflicted by these forms of delusion believe that their delusions are real. Moreover, on the outside, they appear completely normal to their fellow human beings, who judge the false assertions of the schizophrenics as given and, thus, classify those who are sick in consciousness as completely normal, which, as a rule, is also typical of the professionals, such as psychologists and psychiatrists, who can also be deceived just like the layman.
Thanks. Your professional explanation will certainly open the eyes of many human beings. But since you already speak of dead speakers, that is to say of necromancers, I would still like to ask a question in reference to a particular deceased person, if you know something about him. It concerns Leonardo da Vinci, which is certainly a name known to you. One asked me if I would know who his father and mother were. Ptah explained to me on my great journey that Leonardo was the illegitimate offspring from a union of his father, Piero da Vinci, with a beautiful slave girl from the Orient. But I did not want to answer the question in this wise before I had inquired with you again, and indeed, because I am no longer quite sure if I remember Ptah's explanation correctly. You know that through my health collapse in the year 1982, my memory has suffered enormously, so I sometimes confuse some things.
Your recollection corresponds to the truth, so therefore you can transmit a useful explanation.
Mrs.
Do you speak of Mrs.
Yes, I mean this Mrs. She called me and asked the question. She has helped me very much financially on a loan, in order to be able to construct the center in general. Today she lives at times in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and in Europe.
She owes you her life and will never forget that. I know this because I know the story about her and you, and I have concerned myself with her character.
Simya once spoke of the fact that in the distant future, somewhere in the mountains of the Rhine Valley, a volcano will break out, which is currently inactive but which will also become active in the subsoil, like also various volcanoes somewhere in Germany, which will also become active again in the distant future. One has also asked me about this, but unfortunately I no longer know what place in Germany was meant.
It is not a place, but rather an entire area, which is designated as Eiffel. There prevails a great slumbering of underground volcanism, which will produce powerful above-ground eruptions again in the distant future and destroy entire landscapes.
Yes, exactly, that was the name. Then still another question. Gilgamesh was descended from a race that came from a galaxy that is still unknown on Earth. Moreover, he was about 3 meters tall. How can it be that he still lives on Earth today unrecognized? Relatively seen to the Earth humans, he also does not age, for he, as you have explained, is 50,000 years old or more. And since you know him so well and also have the possibility of taking him back to his world, why do you not do this?
You are mistaken in reference to the fact that the home galaxy of Gilgamesh is unknown on Earth because it was already discovered in the year 1781 by an astronomer named Mechin. This is a somewhat oval spiral galaxy, which is simply called M94, NGC 4736 by the earthly astroscientists, and which is seen about 20 million light-years away from the Earth.
In our space-time configuration?
That is of correctness. But listen further. With Gilgamesh's people, it concerned a race of morphogenetic ones, whose special ability was to change their shape and size. A process that took several months for each occurrence, however.
First of all, why do you speak of concerned and was? And secondly, does your explanation with regard to the morphogenetic ones mean that it concerns a morphogenesis, precisely in terms of biological morphology? Morphogenesis, nevertheless, refers to the formation of an organism or life form during his or her development, whereby everything depends on the hereditary predisposition and on the environment. Do you mean this?
No, that is not the meaning of my words. Rather, I speak of a shape-shifting that can be carried out arbitrarily during normal existence.
Do you mean, for example, when the development of the physical body has already been completed? By this, I mean that a shape-shifting can be accomplished when...
That is the meaning of my words, yes.
Shape-shifting. Then one could very well call these humans shapeshifters. Can they change then also their external and internal features, apart from their shapes?
That is of correctness.
You have not yet answered my question, however, as to why you said concerned and was.
Gilgamesh's people no longer exists because a sudden and unpredictable planetary catastrophe caused the whole race to become extinct within a few minutes. There were no survivors because no human beings of this people also stayed outside of the planet. Gilgamesh is, thus, the sole survivor who has adapted his shape, however, to that of the earthly human, and has morphogenetically transformed and found a new home in this world, which he no longer wants to leave.
Oh, so that is how it is. Then something else. You recently said something about a water shortage that would be on Earth in the coming time.
Yes, already in the coming 90s, the drinking water on the Earth will become a rare commodity in certain countries. Thus, there will be a big drinking water problem that, especially in the so-called developing countries, will lead to very big problems and even to catastrophes. In contrast to this, however, the encouraging fact will arise that some areas which have been destroyed and made barren by the Earth humans will slowly recover again purely according to nature and become green. Nevertheless, this process will only proceed slowly and bring success, always provided that everything will not be newly ruined and destroyed again by the human beings, which is to be feared, unfortunately, when one considers their illogical and profit-demanding thinking and behavior.
This fear probably exists rightfully. Then I once again have a question regarding the Egyptian pyramids, as I was also asked about them. Unfortunately, I no longer remember exactly what Ptah, Semyase, and Asked explained to me, but somehow, I think it was said to me that the first pyramids were built around 73,300 years ago or so, but later dismantled again because they fell to decay, namely through rotting in the interior as well as through the weather. In particular, this refers to the pyramids of Giza, but also to many other pyramids all over the world. Afterwards, everything was rebuilt, which should have happened around 10,800 or 11,000 years ago. At this time, about 300 years before the Great Flood, a certain King Salak was the person of power, who ordered the dismantling and alteration of the Great Pyramid of Giza and allowed this to be carried out. But again, Everything moldered over the course of the following millennia and fell to decay. So about 4,500 years ago, an enormous pyramid work resulted once more, as everything that was moldering and decaying was torn away, removed, and replaced. Thus, accordingly, new stone blocks were cut and then dragged and set up by human power. At the same time, the main pyramid completely lost its internal structure and organization, and it was built anew under the strict power of Cheops and completely revamped. Therefore, one can very well say that the current Pyramid of Giza can actually also be called the Pyramid of Cheops, even though its actual origin traces back to other and partly Earth-foreign builders from the constellation of Orion, and indeed, to a time of 2 stellar ages ago, one of which is reckoned as around 36,650 years, and thus, in a 2 times form, yields a time of 73,300 years, whereby this time must be set before the Islamic Hijra, however. And when we speak of the Pyramid of Giza, we always speak of the pyramid that must be seen as the original pyramid, even if today the new production is addressed, which is, of course, already about 4,500 years old and is exposed to rotting and decay, and which also no longer exhibits its original measure of 152.5 meters in height, but only 146 or 148 meters. This Great Pyramid, together with the others, is aligned in its formatting to the constellation of Orion, while the Khafra structure, the Sphinx structure, was aligned to the constellation of Leo. The new pyramid, as well as all the others in the Sphinx structure, were built in more recent times, so about 4,500 years ago, solely by Earth humans, by their own personnel. The builders were early Egyptians, like also the largest part of the workers, who were free human beings and artisans to a certain part, while many others who came in small numbers as slaves from other countries had to perform their hard work, together with a small number of domestic slaves. That majority of the workers, however, was based on free Egyptians. For the purpose of the nourishment of all workforces, a veritable industrial food city was built near the pyramid, and also mass campsites were provided for resting and sleeping, as well as tombs for the many deceased who were at work there. That is how I remember it being explained to me by you. Now, is this right, or did I fall into a fallacy?
Everything is of correctness, so therefore, no further explanation is necessary.
Already several times, we have talked about gene technology and gene manipulation, etc., about which a lot of senseless fuss will be made in the coming time, and indeed, especially by the so-called progress opponents and, in this case, even the genetic opponents, who will conjure up death and the devil with absurd assertions and scare tactics in order to thwart, stop, and denigrate genetic research and gene technology. This in ignorance of the fact that already for many years, genetically modified vegetables, fruits, and other foods have been produced and have been on the market, and have also been eaten by the genetic opponents, unknowingly and without hesitation, as well as without harm. Now the question about this is whether this fact will actually be concealed much longer?
Silence will probably rule over this for good, because otherwise an uproar would be caused by the genetic opponents.
I understand. Since ancient times, maniacs have always had a tendency to run amok at every possible and impossible opportunity or otherwise to become abusive. I have also just experienced this again, regarding that which I wrote in one of my stories in the storybook, that in the atmosphere the finest dust particles are needed, in which the natural water vapor can condense itself so that raindrops can develop, and thus it can rain. One insulted me rather nastily on the telephone and yelled that I should not write such crap and mislead the children with it and so on. But Svath already taught me that it actually is in such a way as I have written. And if I remember correctly, he called the atmospheric dust particles aerosols.
You have written no falsehoods because the process of rain formation actually takes place in the way that you have represented everything. And the term aerosols also corresponds to the truth.
Then once again, I would like to come to speak on the greenhouse effect and on the climate change. A subject that we have already discussed several times. One thing has escaped me, however, namely what the sun produces on the Earth through its energies, which contributes to the greenhouse effect and to the climate change. The Earth human's destructive influence on the nature of the planet, that is to say, on the atmosphere, takes place through the releasing of carbon dioxide and bromine gases, as well as through the actual chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs for short. Through these substances, so you have explained, a coat or layer, so to speak, is formed around the Earth, whereby the solar heat reflected by the Earth can no longer escape into outer space. From this, an accumulation of heat arises, through which even the greenhouse effect emerges, but this is not solely evoked by the fault of human beings, but rather, to the same extent, also by the sun. However, this does not mean that the guilt of the Earth humans for the greenhouse effect and for the climate change should be minimized, and that the cause for it should be imputed to the sun alone, as the irresponsible scientists in the coming time will do, as you have explained. To be sure, your explanation was that the sun influences the Earth's climate to a very great extent and, thus, also immensely contributes to the climate change and to the greenhouse effect. But at the same time, also very much is done by human beings, even, for example, through the enormous worldwide emissions of hydrocarbons, bromine gases, and CFCs, along with many other emissions of a climate-damaging nature. Now, from time to time, so I mean in large time intervals, especially strong and extremely great and extensive activities arise on the sun, through which enormous quantities of radiation are released and hurled out into space, which then inevitably hit the Earth and influence its entire planetary climate. And exactly this is what it concerns now. That is, this is the specific stuff that it basically concerns here, which acts so powerfully that a greenhouse effect and climate change arise, which also appeared at other times than at the present because major causes for this also lie with humans, also stepped into appearance, and can also appear in the future. This is in stark contrast to when periods of very low solar activity arise, through which very cold times or even glaciation can be caused on the Earth.
You have given an extensive explanation, which shows great knowledge of the addressed matter. Indeed, you amaze me again and again.
It is all half as bad, for on the one hand, Svath taught me a lot of knowledge in this respect, but on the other hand, I also learned a lot at school, even though I was a big truant, and moreover, I am also learning constantly through professional books, professional articles in newspapers and magazines, as well as through professional television broadcasts. But now, what is the specific substance of the sun through which the greenhouse climate and the climate change on the Earth are promoted?
There are several of these, but the most important factor is formed by carbon-14, as it finds its entrance into earthly climatology as a name.
So my long speech did have a sense, nevertheless, because it is probably important to know this. But then, now something else. Professor Sander, I already told you once of him, asked me, since you deal with the prehistoric geology of the Earth, do you know anything about the so-called oceanic Nazca Plate, that is to say, the Nazca Plateau, or know where its origin is to be sought?
The origin of the Nazca Plateau was at a very different place than where it is located today. Around 33 million years ago, it was located about 2,000 kilometers further west in the ocean. The plateau was a volcanic underwater world, on which there were quite enormous volcanic mountains, whose highest peaks protruded far above the ocean's surface, creating a large island archipelago that was surrounded by beautiful paradise reefs. Over the course of millions of years, however, the underwater world sank about 1,500 meters into the depths of the ocean. For my part, the knowledge of the professor, in terms of his knowledge of the Nazca Plate, would interest me.
I will raise an appropriate question with him. Then one last question, after which we can talk about other things that are not to be mentioned officially. The Earth, as I have already seen several times from outer space, somehow continuously changes in its shape, and sometimes looks not quite round and dented. I have seen this through your fantastic devices, which Sim Yase showed me, whereby this phenomenon became known to me. Can you tell me the reason why our planet continuously deforms itself and exhibits bulges as well as depressions? Do our scientists already know this at all?
To my knowledge, this fact is still unknown among the Earth humans. The reason for the daily changing, uneven regularity of the planet, which exhibits a certain elliptical shape, is to be found in the fact that depending on the density of the matter and the water masses, a changing gravity or gravitational force results. This means that the density of the water masses and the solid matter changes continually and indeed uninterruptedly. Through this, for example, large areas with higher densities of matter or water swell out in a bump-shaped manner, whereby even bulges emerge. The areas opposing these collapse in and form depressions or craters when a low density of matter or water masses is given, as was explained to me by Pei. An additional role is played by the moon, which also must be involved in these processes.
But now, a few more things still come to my mind, which I would like to ask you. As it follows from your explanations, life on Earth originated in the water, whereby it then developed in the shore sand of the waters. This is in complete contrast to the claims of the earthly scientists, whose explanations purport that life had developed from the so-called primordial soup. If I still remember correctly, completely in accordance with your information, life is to have originated in the fresh waters of the earth. Seas, however, are very salty, at least here on Earth, whereby the highly sensitive genetic material and outer covers of the first organisms would have probably been destroyed because salt water is extremely aggressive, and the life forms that emerged first were still highly susceptible to such influences. So I ask myself, what type of water was given then in which life could evolve before it could also find its way in salt water at a later time?
The salt water of primeval times was actually very aggressive in the primordial seas and contained values that were twice and 3 times as high as those of the current salt concentrations in the earthly seas. Thus, life also did not originate in these salty primordial seas, which were also partly strong in potassium, but rather in smaller and larger land waters, in small and large ponds, as well as in small or larger lakes, which consisted of fresh water that arose from torrential rains.
Then still this. On my great journey with Sim Yase and Ta and his great spacer, we also flew to the so-called Andromeda Nebula, as this enormous structure is erroneously called by the earthly astronomers, because they just assume that it would concern a galactic nebula. But as I could see with my own eyes, this structure is not a nebula, but an enormous galaxy, in which many solar systems exist with their own planets, a large number of which also carries diverse and even human life. My question: why do the earthly astronomers constantly say that Andromeda is a nebula? Do they actually not know that it is a galaxy with suns and planets and all the trimmings, which exactly constitutes a real galaxy?
This fact is still unknown to them, which is why they still speak of an Andromeda Nebula. This is due, not in the least, to the fact that their astronomical instruments are not yet sufficient to be able to see the reality of the Andromeda Galaxy. Their instruments are still too insufficient to be able to recognize more than just a nebula at a distance of about 2 million light-years away, which is the distance from the Earth to the Andromeda Galaxy. In the newer time, however, this will change, and to be sure, in the coming 90s or at the beginning of the new millennium at the latest, when the Hubble Space Telescope fulfills its function.
That was my last question. Then we can now turn to the other things.